Even Senator Smoot could not survive the landslide of disapproval that came with the Great Depression. He lost re-election to a man named Elbert D. Thomas, who is a fellow Latter-day Saint.
This is not some minor political side character we're talking about here.
So after Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Thomas was one of the first people that began to recognize the danger.
Congress will force the issue if the administration doesn't.
The Nazis intended to rule the world.
He's tying his political work to his religious conviction. I know what's right here.
He's a person that stands by his convictions. He's a good person.
True change comes in men's hearts and ideas. So I supported the experimentation that resulted in the atom bomb.
Something that powerful might change men's hearts and ideas about war.
This guy. Wow.
Hello, Scott.
Hello, Casey.
Hey, welcome back. Today we're continuing our series on the church and politics. So last time we made it up to the beginning of the 20th century, a little bit after. And actually, I think we made it up to 1933 when Reed Smoot left the Senate. Yeah, so we're well into the 20th century now. There's a lot going on. Maybe we need to recap a little bit. So, all right, we agreed last time we made it up to the beginning of the 20th century, the first couple decades. Today, we're diving into some of the key events of the first half of the 20th century. Big stuff.
Yeah, so before we dig into that, let's do just a quick recap to make sure you're all with us. The first thing you need to know about this series is that early on, there was not really a line between church and state among Latter-day Saints. Like civic leaders were often in ecclesiastical positions of leadership as well.
Yeah, and the sterling example of this is Joseph Smith himself, who serves as mayor of Nauvoo while simultaneously serving as president of the church. And we've noted in the final year of his life, he also ran for president of the United States, and his platform had a number of controversial positions. Just name a few. He favored more humane prisons, the annexation of Texas, and the end of slavery by 1850.
Yeah, and as we discussed, politics played a role in his death. No question about that. In fact, no less an authority than Dallin H. Oakes, who wrote this before he became a general authority, but he called Joseph Smith's death, quote, a politically motivated assassination. The people who killed Joseph Smith were worried about his growing political power in the United States, so that certainly contributed to his death.
Yeah. And after Joseph's death, the Saints moved to the Great Basin of Western North America, where for a time they're practically allowed to set up their own country, though technically the war between Mexico and the United States that was fought in 1846 placed that part of the world under American control.
Yeah, and during this time, again, there's very little separation between church and state. Brigham Young was the prophet. He was also the governor. He's also the superintendent of Indian affairs in the area. His tenure as governor will end with the Utah War of 1856. But during his leadership, he plays a careful game of trying to work with the federal government while working to secure the rights of the saints at the same time.
Yeah, and as we discussed, this is part of the context that affects a number of hot button issues, things like slavery, race, the rights of minorities. All this kind of comes into the picture. Because Brigham Young was both the civil and religious leader, a lot of these controversies found their way into the theological discussions in the church. And that's a vital part of understanding the context for things like the temple and priesthood bans that extended well into the 20th century.
So there were a lot of good things that come from that and a couple not so good things that happened during that time. The foundations were laid for the priesthood and temple restriction on Black Africans. But Utah Territory was also one of the first places in the U.S. to offer women the right to vote. Technically, we mentioned Wyoming beat Utah in providing women's suffrage, but Utah was the first place in the country where women actually did vote. So something to be proud of. Shout out Utah. Good job.
Yeah. And now, during the same time...
And Wyoming. And by the way, Wyoming.
And Wyoming.
Good job Wyoming as well.
Yes, we have nothing against Wyoming.
Great job.
I am a Utahn, and so I was a little competitive. but love Wyoming. Go Evanston, all that stuff.
Go Wyoming. Great fireworks. Great fireworks.
Yeah, great fireworks, all that good stuff. Okay, so during the same time, political crusades are being led by members of the U.S. government over the practice of plural marriage and the temporal control that the church had in the Great Basin. So during these conflicts, the church set up its own political party, generally known as the People's Party. And other elements in Utah set up a party in opposition that was known as the Liberal Party.
But things began to change quickly when Official Declaration 1 was given by President Wilford Woodruff. This was the beginning of the end of plural marriage, which meant that the primary barrier to Utah becoming a state was now removed, and things started to move quickly in that direction.
Yeah, and this also causes a huge round of reorganization where the Saints were asked to give up the People's Party and join one of the two national political parties, which set up some interesting conflicts between some church leaders. For instance, Moses Thatcher and B.H. Roberts are both Democrats, while others like Joseph F. Smith and John Henry Smith ended up being Republicans.
And after Utah becomes a state in January 1896, church leaders wanted to show that the church would not control the new state government. So they issued in April of that year what became known as the Political Manifesto. It said that general authorities of the church should not run for or accept political office without first receiving permission from the first presidency.
Yeah. And we should state that the goal here wasn't to keep Latter-day Saints out of politics. In fact, ordinary church members were encouraged to join either the Republican or Democratic Party and participate fully in civic life. Instead, the manifesto was meant to draw a clear line between church leadership and partisan politics to help reassure both Utahns and the rest of the country that the church was committed to religious leadership rather than political control.
And some church leaders, though, like Moses Thatcher, believed the political manifesto went too far. And while he supported the church, he was an apostle. Thatcher felt that deciding whether to run for public office or not was a personal right that should not require approval of the first presidency. In his view, church leaders should be free to participate in politics as individual citizens of the nation without needing permission from other church leaders. He worried that the manifesto was actually blurring the line between church and state instead of strengthening it.
Yeah. And because Thatcher refuses to agree with the new policy, his disagreement with the first presidency grows into a larger conflict. And in 1896, he's actually removed from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. His case becomes one of the best known examples of the tensions between religious authority and political participation in early Utah history.
Yeah, and these were, let's call them internal church matters. Mm-hmm. But there's also a lot of opposition to permitting Latter-day Saints to serve in federal government outside the church. For instance, we talked about B.H. Roberts, who won the election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1898, but he was never allowed to take his seat. Now, the problem wasn't that he was a Latter-day Saint per se. It was that he was still living plural marriage. He had 3 wives. He had even had a child since the 1890 manifesto, which ended plural marriage. And that became all the scandal throughout the United States. And so that convinced a lot of people outside of Utah that the church really hadn't given up polygamy. And so they thought that they would not want him in Congress.
Yeah. So after months of debate and hearings, the U.S. House of Representatives voted in 1900 to keep B.H. Roberts from taking office. And they argued that continued violation of federal anti-polygamy laws made him unfit to serve. The controversy put even more pressure on church leaders to demonstrate that plural marriage had really ended, which paved the way for a stronger second manifesto that's issued a few years later.
So that leads to the final showdown following the election of Apostle Reed Smoot. This is what we talked about in our last episode, to the U.S. Senate, right? So he's an apostle, and he's elected to the U.S. Senate. This is just 5 years after the B.H. Roberts fallout. So when Smoot was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1902, it sets off one of the biggest political controversies of the era. Unlike B.H. Roberts, Reed Smoot was a monogamist. He had never been in a plural marriage. So this kind of shifts the ground a little bit. So the controversy in the U.S. Senate, although he was accused of being a polygamist, he had to kind of prove that had never happened. But the central controversy was that he was an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who had made temple covenants and faithfulness to God and the church, and would that override his loyalties to the nation, right? Many people question whether someone who held such a high church position and had made such covenants could serve independently as a U.S. senator. And others were skeptical that the church had really abandoned plural marriage.
Yeah. So the Senate spends several years investigating Smoot. They hold extensive hearings about both his personal beliefs and church practices. So in the end, no evidence showed that Smoot had entered into plural marriage or broken the law. And in 1907, the Senate votes to let him keep his seat. And this decision marks a huge turning point, signaling that the Latter-day Saints are becoming more fully accepted in American political life. So, I mean, the Reed-Smoot hearings are painful for the church, but they're probably necessary to drag us into the mainstream of American life and politics. Reed-Smoot effectively shatters the glass ceiling against an active Latter-day Saint serving in the federal government.
And as we mentioned last time, it opens the door for other Latter-day Saints to serve there. Senator Smoot served in the Senate from 1903 to 1933, a 30-year run, which is impressive. Among other things, I don't think we mentioned this, but he was the chair of the Senate Finance Committee from 1923 to 1933. He also co-sponsored the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, one of the most debated pieces of economic legislation in American history. So he wasn't just there, he was embedded into the whole process and was influential.
Yeah, and when Reed-Smoot's name pops up, it's usually in connection to those tariffs, which deserve a whole other podcast on their own. They initiate these tariffs when the Great Depression is happening, thinking that they'll keep things in the United States manufacturing here. And people still debate whether they backfired, whether they made the Depression better or worse. But the bottom line is even Senator Smoot could not survive the landslide of disapproval that came with the Great Depression. So in 1932, he lost re-election to a man named Elbert D. Thomas, who is a fellow Latter-day Saint and a professor at the University of Utah. And that leads us to today's focus, where we're going to look at Senator Thomas, Elbert D. Thomas's life and service, kind of a mid-20th century figure that shows how we bridge the gap from what it was like at the first of the 20th century when it was hard to imagine a Latter-day Saint serving in Congress to this guy who is incredibly influential for a long period of time in the mid-20th century.
Yeah, so Elbert Thomas's career stretched across the Great Depression, World War II, and the early Cold War. He became a surprisingly forgotten figure, Casey, and that's a shame because this is not some minor political side character we're talking about here. He's a 3-term U.S. senator. He's a scholar. He's a missionary. He's a diplomat in spirit, if not always in title, and someone whose service touched not just Americans, but Jewish refugees, Japanese nationals, and American GIs.
Yeah. In fact, Utah Governor John M. Huntsman Jr. Designated the 8th of April, 2005 as Elbert Thomas Day to honor the late senator's role in Washington, D.C. during a really critical time in U.S. history.
And do your children celebrate that today, Casey?
Oh, yeah. You know, we dress up like Elbert Thomas, and I don't. Was it just one day, or was it like it must have
a
just
rolling
been
holiday?
I don't think it's a rolling holiday in Utah history. But hey, the next 8th of April, dress up like Elbert Thomas just to celebrate his legacy. Because as we're going to explore in this episode, he did a lot of stuff that was really, really important, and he did it while being a recognized, known Latter-day Saint. He never shied away from his religious affiliation. So
next April 8th, check your kids out of school and listen to this episode of Church History Matters together while eating your favorite food. How about that?
That would be another good thing to do, yes.
Yeah, the point is this man deserves more attention than he gets. And so that's why we thought we would bring him up and talk and really dedicate a whole episode to his influence. So Let's start where his story starts, with his upbringing and the forces that shaped him, real briefly.
And let me mention the other reason why we wanted to talk about Elbert Thomas, which I'm guessing not a lot of you have heard about, is because he's kind of like a Forrest Gump figure. He's there for a lot of the crucial moments in Latter-day Saint political history. And then when he's serving in the Senate, he seems to be everywhere and involved in huge events like the worries over Nazi persecutions of Jewish people. He's heavily involved in the war with Japan, even the development of the atomic bomb. And he just keeps showing up in really interesting places. So he's a good figure to kind of show you how Latter-day Saints were involved in some of the key events of these really, really important years of the early 20th century.
Okay, so Casey, how does he get involved in politics? Tell us a little bit about his backstory and how he gets there.
Okay. So Elbert Thomas grows up in Salt Lake City in the late 1800s during a period of intense persecution and prosecution toward the Latter-day Saints because of plural marriage. In fact, he later wrote, quote, "I saw the confiscation of Mormon property and the Mormon leaders disenfranchised by the federal government."
That kind of experience would stick in the memory. And maybe that helps explain why he spent much of his life working as a labor advocate and mediator. He wants people to receive what he saw as just and humane treatment from corporations and the federal government. That was super important to him.
Yeah. And we should mention part of his backstory, too, is that he's the fifth of 12 children born to Richard and Caroline Thomas, who are British converts who come to the United States in 1863. So he is the child of immigrants. And that affects his views. And his parents also were notable because they loved the arts, especially the theater. They built a barn and playhouse combination in that they called the Barnacle. That's a great name for your your barn and playhouse combination. Okay, all right, yeah.
That's an amazing family project. The Barnacle. Sounds like where Shakespeare would have held like a weirdly enthusiastic community theater production, you know?
Yeah, it kind of does. And Elbert was involved in a lot of plays there. His father, however, also used the Barnacle for conventions and political rallies. And Thomas later wrote, "My father was always a leading businessman. He was a sagebrush Democrat in that he became a Democrat when the state divided on party lines."
And that quote kind of says a lot, right? Like, he's going to inherit a sense that public life mattered and that the federal government could be a force for good as well.
Right. And that belief follows him into education, public service, and then eventually national politics.
And didn't he also have some military experience early on in his life?
Yeah. So in 1906, he's commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Utah National Guard. And around the same time, his parents move into this big home at 137 Northwest Temple Street, which actually is still there today. I believe it's a national public landmark, if I'm remembering correctly.
Okay. So while the family is building homes and theaters, Elbert's already building a public life.
Yeah, so when he attends the University of Utah, things really started to kick off. He helps found what's known as the Amici Fidemissimi. I hope I'm saying that right. Amici Fidemissimi.
Could you say that one more time?
Amici Fidemissimi. I've got to use my Italian accent. It's Latin for most faithful friends, which is a student literary and social society at the University of Utah that's founded in the early 1900s. And at a time when the university didn't have a lot of national fraternities, organizations like Amici Fidemissimi gave students opportunities for friendship, intellectual discussion, public speaking, debates, and social activities. And he also gets involved in the Utah Dramatic Club and begins dating Edna Harker, who, spoiler, is going to become his wife.
And Edna's not just a quiet side character in the story either, is she?
No. She's a really popular actress who performed at the Salt Lake Theater. Later, she teaches physical education. And here's the interesting thing. Okay, they court, they get engaged, and then they're called on a 5-year mission to Japan. So as husband and wife, they're both asked to go to Japan for 5 years.
Wow. I guess as a married couple, that's a little more palatable than being a single guy for 5 years.
Yeah, but wow. I mean,
but wow,
yeah.
Yeah, so that's where their story kind of goes international here now.
Yeah. This is where the story starts to widen. So after they get married on June 25th, 1907. Elbert is set apart by Apostles Heber J. Grant and George Albert Smith, and he goes to Japan where he serves as mission secretary. And then in 1910, he becomes the mission president. And he's a pretty young guy to be a mission president too.
Okay, so they're becoming just absolutely immersed in Japanese culture here.
Yeah. This isn't a short cultural visit. They both Elbert and Edna become fluent in Japanese. They sort of fall in love with the people of Japan, their culture, and it also sort of cultivates this lasting interest in international affairs, but particularly Asian cultures. They named their daughter Chiyo, a Japanese name, which could mean 1,000 years or 1,000 generations. Anyway, they become a big part of Japanese culture, which is going to have a huge impact on his senatorial service later on in his life. Yeah,
that's important context, right? So before he ever gets to the U.S. Senate, he's already become international in his outlook, right? It's no secret after serving the Japanese people for 5 years that he's going to love them. But it's also no secret that one of the primary antagonists of the United States during Elbert's service in the Senate during World War II was also Japan. And so this comes into play later.
Yeah, foreshadowing for our later story. Now, another important thing that happens is on their return to the United States, the Thomases decide to do kind of a world tour. And they travel through Europe, and they visit Palestine, which at the time is occupied by the Ottoman Empire. And when they get there, they reflect on the plight of the Jews and the loss of their temple. In fact, Elbert Thomas later writes this. He said, "That evening that Palestine impressed me most was when Mrs. Thomas and I sat on the Mount of Olives and looked across the valley to the place of the temple and the Mosque of Omar. While our baby gathered pebbles, we read the dedicatorial prayer offered by Orson Hyde on October 21st, 1841, when the land of Palestine was dedicated by a Mormon elder sent by the prophet Joseph Smith to dedicate Palestine for the return of the Jews. Here again, deep, meaningful, long-range spiritual understanding entered my soul. At the time I read the prayer, just 20 years after the dedication of our own temple, a few Jews were returning to Palestine to be buried near Jerusalem. Tel Aviv was a doubtful venture, for in all there were only 60 or 70,000 Jews in the Holy Land. Belief in the restoration of Jerusalem is part of my religion."
That's a super cool passage. You can already see the development of his future advocacy for Jewish refugees and Zionism starting to take shape there, right?
Exactly. And when he's back in Utah, Thomas becomes an instructor of Greek and Latin at the University of Utah. So you can see he's involved in a lot of things. He also serves as secretary and registrar, and he later took leave to attend UCLA, where he earned a PhD in government.
So now we have the convergence of a few factors here, right? We've got the missionary, we've got the scholar, we've got the public intellectual, we've got this deep compassion for Japan, for the Jews. This is all kind of converging in the soul of one man.
Yeah. So when he goes to the University of Utah, he taught political science, history, and Asian languages. So that's a wide ranging set of interests to begin with. And in 1926, he travels to Europe to study international law and relations at The Hague, Geneva, and Paris. And there he delivers a speech titled "World Unity Through the Study of History."
That title alone is a little telling, isn't it? It tells you a lot about how his mind worked.
Yeah, it does.
This is a man he's a unifier.
Yeah. And he argues that conflicting national interests give rise to wars, revolts, disease, and famine. But when trade is free, peace is, that's the kernel of his argument.
So it's optimistic, it's idealistic, and he's not very much of a cynic, we'll to say.
Yeah, and definitely not. And his reputation continues to grow as an international scholar, especially after he published a study called Chinese Political Thought in 1927.
Yeah, then the Depression hits.
Yeah. So after having witnessed the start of the Great Depression, which impacts Utah quite a bit, Thomas starts arguing for greater cooperation between the state and the federal government. Meanwhile, he's bumping up against another figure that we've talked about, Reed Smoot, who is a major figure in Utah politics.
And Smoot-Hawley policy that Reed Smoot passes, that becomes one of the big defining issues, doesn't it?
Yeah. In fact, in 1930, Smoot sponsors the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which increased duties on almost 900 imports. These were kind of retaliatory tariffs from other countries, and they actually make the Depression worse. And Thomas disagrees with this and promises political science students that he thinks Senator Smoot, who's kind of an institution, can be defeated.
That's a pretty confident thing to say to students about a senator who's been in place for 30 years now almost.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is he makes good on it. He runs for office and he defeats Smoot in 1932. And now he's the senator calling the shots.
Okay, so now this is the part of a story where he goes to Washington during the years called the New Deal years, right?
Yeah. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt and all these massive changes that happened to try and counter the Great Depression. Thomas is elected at the same time as FDR. And he rides this Democratic wave into office and serves during the crucial years where the Roosevelt administration is setting up the New Deal and a number of government initiatives that still affect us today. You know, the Social Security is probably the most prominent one, but huge things. And while he's there, you know, he becomes part of this colony of Latter-day Saints in Washington, D.C. In fact, interesting side note, there was this chapel. It wasn't a temple, but it's this chapel. Alonzo Gaskell has written a great history of it. The chapel's still there on 16th Street in Washington. It has a huge angel Moroni on top of it, like a temple size angel Moroni. Not that the angel Moroni was the size of the temple, but this angel Moroni is actually in the Church History Museum today as kind of a symbol of taking the gospel to the world. And by the way, side note, the chapel was sold by the church a long time ago to the Moonies. Do you know who the Moonies?
No, what's a Moonie?
The Moonies are this unique kind of Christian but Korean religion that was founded by the Reverend Sun Young Moon. And they purchased the chapel. The church took the angel Moroni off the chapel. But I was in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago with Alex Baugh, and we got into the chapel. Alex tried to, I hope I don't embarrass Alex by saying this, but he tried to bribe the Moonies to let us in. And the Moonies were like, no, you can just come in. And we walked in, and there's still Doctrine and Covenants quotes like chiseled into the walls. Okay, and you can just see how the church invested a lot in this chapel. So, Reed Smoot started the path where the church realized, you know what, we can have a lot more influence if we have people in the government. And so this is where Elbert Thomas, you imagine, is worshiping alongside a figure like Ezra Taft Benson, who's very influential in Washington, D.C. too, during this exact same time. So, I mean, Benson's a Republican and Thomas is a Democrat, but it seems like, on Sunday, everybody's a Latter-day Saint. Anyway, go and find that history by Alonzo Gaskell. Cool. That chapel has a fascinating story attached to it.
And if you go and you want to visit it, the Moonies will probably just let you in. You don't even have to bribe them.
You don't have to bribe the Moonies. It was attempted bribery. So again, nothing illegal happened. And Alex Baugh still stands as a credit to the Latter-day Saint historical community. Sorry, Alex.
Alex is the best.
Yeah, Alex
is the best. Okay, so talk to us about how he's in Washington, but there's a domestic side of his legacy there too. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So let's cover that really quick. So a major part of what he does is his domestic initiative. So he's chair of the Senate Committee on Education and Labor. He works to establish the Civilian Conservation Corps, which employs millions of unemployed young men in environmental projects and national parks. And in Utah, CCC camps build trails, parking areas, campgrounds, park buildings. They help fight fires. They reduce flooding. When you go to a national park, usually you can trace, every railing or staircase or outhouse back to the CCC because they're just so desperate to get people to work that they do this during the Great Depression.
And that's the sort of thing people often forget about when we talk about the New Deal, right? It's not abstract. It's trails, it's wages, it's infrastructure like this, it's national parks.
Yeah. So in addition to that, he also co-authored the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, which established maximum hours, overtime pay, and a minimum wage. So he moderated negotiations that resolved the nationwide strike and helped create the Department of Education and Social Services, the National Science Foundation, and other agencies as well.
Man, it's kind of a big deal, is what we're trying to say.
He did a lot of stuff.
He's a major labor and public policy figure before the war fully consumes the world.
But that's where his advocacy broadens again. So after Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, Thomas was one of the first people that began to recognize the danger. In 1934, he gives a speech titled World Unity as Recorded in History, and he argues for world peace, and he warned that Hitler's hatred of the Jews could threaten it.
Do you remember exactly how he said that?
Yeah. So here's his exact quote. He said, quote, "Hitler and his attack on the Jews is viewed by most as a purely local or national problem. Is it only that? Hitlerism may be classified as a new religion, contesting with the older order. Hitlerism, viewed as a spiritual movement, must of necessity be anti-Jewish." End of quote.
Yeah. Oof. That is sharp. That is early. He saw the spiritual and political danger, the writing on the wall, long before many others did.
He did.
To his credit.
He did. And we should add that he travels to Germany during this time, where he meets with Rudolf Hess, one of Hitler's top lieutenants. And he comes back and concluded that these are his words, that the Nazis intended to rule the world. So early in the 1930s, he can see where the train's heading, that the Nazis are not intending to initiate world peace, that they're looking at world domination.
Wow, not exactly a reassuring trip.
Yeah, not at all. And when he returns to Washington, he first argues for neutrality. Starting in 1935, he gives a national radio forum address that America, in his words, must stay out of war. So he doesn't want to go to war with them, but he's seeing this increasing storm cloud on the horizon.
But then he changes his mind, doesn't he?
Yeah. So once he learned that the State Department was minimizing the refugee crisis being caused in Germany and refusing to fill immigration quotas, he becomes concerned. When news of human rights violations started to come out of Germany, Thomas introduced Senate Joint Resolution 67 to aid, this is the wording from the resolution, victims of aggression.
And that effort failed because the country was still reluctant to take on the moral risks of doing so. But
yeah, it does fail, but he keeps pressing. So Thomas is starting to realize the danger. And what we're hinting at here is he's seeing the early steps taken in Germany that are eventually going to lead to the Jewish Holocaust, where 5 to 6 million Jews perish at the hands of the Nazis and the people that collaborate with them.
Yeah, he clearly understood that a rescue mission of some sort could matter, even if not enough to rescue everybody. But he knew that we could do something and that would matter.
Yeah. So he is an avid Zionist throughout his life. He wants Palestine to be a gathering place for the Jews. And on November 1st, 1942, which is the 25th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Just to give some context, the Balfour Declaration was this movement that really kicks off Zionism, that gets a lot of Jewish people to start moving to Palestine, later found the state of Israel. I mean, we're still dealing with this stuff today, and Zionism is sort of a controversial term in our time, Scott, right now. But Thomas gives this speech in Carnegie Hall, urging the United States to, quote, establish a Jewish commonwealth in Palestine as one of our war aims and peace aims. He wants the United States to be part of this.
That's a huge statement in wartime America.
Yeah, it is. And Thomas becomes one of the most vocal advocates for rescuing Jewish people from Nazi-controlled Europe. He works really closely with a Jewish activist named Peter Bergson and his group. He signed a full-page newspaper ad criticizing Allied inaction, and he co-chaired Bergson's 1943 conference that was all about how do we rescue Jewish people in Nazi-controlled Europe.
And I love that line where he basically says, Congress will force the issue if the administration doesn't.
Yeah, that's one of the best parts of the story. Thomas helps advance the Gillette-Rogers congressional resolution and push for a government agency to rescue Jews from Nazis. And when Senator Tom Connolly blocked the resolution, Thomas said, hey, wait, and one day I'll preside and it will pass unanimously.
And then it did.
Yeah, it does. So Connolly becomes ill, and Thomas introduces the measure, and it passes unanimously. And his Jewish friend, Bergson, remembered that Thomas was, this is kind of the classic Thomas quote. He said, Thomas was, quote, a very much admired man in the Senate. He was a very religious man. And then he says, he was a real Mormon, a real practicing religious man. And the fact that he stood, and Johnson stood, and Gillette made a small but very strong core.
That's a cool and powerful testimony from someone inside the rescue movement.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, it's interesting how within a generation, Reed Smoot, we talked in our last episode about one of the charges against him was just he was a Mormon, like, period. He's a Mormon, so he must be a bad person. Within the time Elbert Thomas is in the Senate, he was a real Mormon is a major compliment that this guy issues to him. Like, he's a person that stands by his convictions. He's a good person. And this effort eventually brings about the War Refugee Board. In fact, in January of 1844, Henry Morgenthau Jr. warned Roosevelt, you've either got to move very fast or the Congress of the United States is just going to do this for you. So Roosevelt, get yourself in gear. Congress is going to take over, which it's never the case where we're like, oh, if the president doesn't do it, Congress will do it.
And this is one of those moments in history where pressure from below, from Congress here, and from above actually move history, right?
Yeah. So I mean, Roosevelt creates the board, and although it was understaffed and underfunded, agents from this board helped save more than 200,000 Jews during the final 15 months of the war.
And Thomas was a crucial part of the chain that makes this happen, to his credit.
Yeah. One person, Raphael Madoff, phrased it this way. He said, quote, at a time when too many people and governments turned their back on Hitler's Jewish victims, Senator Elbert D. Thomas was a voice of courage and humanitarianism on Capitol Hill.
Bam. There's a legacy worth remembering. That's worth right there doing a whole podcast on this guy, don't you think? Yeah,
that's why it's kind of a shame he's underappreciated. I mean, that's a big deal. And by the way, that's not the only thing significant he does during World War II. On the home front, he focuses the war effort in Utah. So he brings kind of Utah's resources to bear. After Pearl Harbor, he's already thinking ahead. And with this support, Congress passed the Wilcox-Wilson Bill, authorizing a permanent Air Corps station in the Rocky Mountains. And this is going to have, again, like ripple effects on things.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly because of him that Utah becomes full of military installations, right?
Yeah. So he supported the Ogden Arsenal, which expanded into a major storage site. He helped bring or improve installations like the Hill Field Air Depot, the Wendover Army Air Base, the Kearns Army Air Base, the Dugway Proving Ground, Tooele Army Depot, Deseret Chemical Depot, Bushnell General Military Hospital, and the Clearfield Naval Supply Depot. That's a lot.
That's a whole wartime map right there.
Yeah, it really is. And he also helps complete the Geneva steel mill. You remember when we were growing up, the big Geneva steel mill in Utah Valley, which becomes a huge part of the war effort and the wartime economy as well.
Okay, so then let's talk about his link to his work in Japan, which is especially interesting given his earlier missionary service there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because he speaks Japanese fluently and he knows about Japanese politics and culture. The Office of War Information invited him to broadcast monthly radio messages to Japan and also to American audiences. So on the 7th day of each month, from December 1941 until the end of the war, he urged Japanese citizens to overthrow their government and end the war.
Wow. And how did he explain his reasoning on that?
Okay, so here's how he explains it. This is a quote from him. He said, "I had but one theme, and that was that Japan was ruining herself because she had turned apostate to the best ideals that Japanese civilization had developed. I knew how the Japanese constitution worked. I knew that the generals in the field were absolute. They could not be controlled by the home government. I knew, therefore, that we had to have a constitutional surrender under the auspices of the emperor. The opposition to my ideas by those who wanted to destroy and bring anarchy in Japan hurt me in much the same way as all prejudicial opposition has hurt me. But in this activity, as in my religious activity, I was sustained by a sense of knowing that I was right."
That's a cool line. One of the strongest in the whole piece. Like he's tying his political work to his religious conviction. I know what's right here. And
I'm going to do what's
the
right.
Japanese, moved him to want to do what's right. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, so his monthly messages made the Japanese wartime leaders treat him as an enemy, but later Japanese scholars honored his role in promoting peace and understanding. He's trying to get people to see that it's not the Japanese people that are our enemies, that it was their government that was causing these things to happen.
But that message didn't get to the end of the row back in the U.S., because meanwhile, the United States is descending into anti-Japanese fear during the same time, right?
Yeah. So after Pearl Harbor, the fear and paranoia surrounding Japanese Americans explodes. In 1942, FDR issues Executive Order 9066, which forced about 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry into relocation camps that were based on their race, not anything that they did.
And Thomas objected to that heartily.
Yeah, he did. He tried to promote more humane treatment and understanding. In fact, one historian, Nancy J. Taniguchi, described how in Utah some Japanese Americans were able to work land and businesses, while others face confiscation, suspicion, and hardship. Thomas tries to mitigate this wartime hysteria.
Yeah, but he was kind of swimming against the current by this point in terms of U.S. sentiment, wasn't he?
Yeah, and this is, this affects me growing up. One of the largest Japanese relocation camps was the Topaz relocation camp, which is just a couple miles out of the town I grew up in. So I grew up in Delta in central Utah. And there's a Topaz museum right on Main Street that tells the history of the Japanese relocation camp. And you can actually drive out and see where the camp was. All that's left now is basically barbed wire and the cement pads that everything was built on. But the museum itself is pretty amazing. Now, the other thing that you notice when you go to the Topaz site is it's not a pleasant place. Like Delta is a pleasant place to grow up, but the land surrounding Delta is not the Garden of Eden. I guess I'll say it that way. Deltans that are listening to this will be okay with me saying this. It's the desert. But then when you see like what their barracks were like, that their barracks were uninsulated and it could get really cold and really hot there. The temperatures were bad. It was a tough place to live. And these people, like I said, are placed there because of their race. Not because they've done anything wrong. So Thomas argues against this. He doesn't win, but the fact that he stood up and says, hey, we need more humanity. We need to understand these people. That speaks well for him, even if popular opinion largely turned against him.
Good job, Thomas.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's transition into the final phase of the war. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so he's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Thomas, because of this, knows about the atomic bomb project. In his autobiography, he wrote, quote, "I could never rid myself of the idea that ultimate victory can only come through a change in men's hearts and ideas. More with that zeal than the idea to destroy, I supported the experimentation which resulted in the atom bomb." So he is... That's a complicated sentence,
and kind of a complicated moral position to hold.
Yeah, more than with that zeal. So he thought it could change the hearts and ideas. I supported the experimentation, which was. It seems like he has qualms with the atomic bomb and how it turned out. That he felt like it wasn't going to. What do you think he's saying there? I mean,
so more with that zeal, the zeal that true change can only come in men's hearts and ideas, with that zeal in mind than the idea to destroy, I supported the experimentation which resulted in the atom bomb. Sounds like he's saying, well, I don't know if this is what he's saying, but today we have what's called the, what do we call it? The assurance of mutually assured
destruction. MAD.
That's the one. Mutually assured destruction. So there's this idea in men's minds that if one nation nukes another nation, then it's going to lead to that nation nuking back, and both sides are going to be destroyed. So the fact that I know that you've got a nuke and you know that I got a nuke keeps us from entering into the kind of conflict that would end in our mutually assured destruction. I don't know if he's going there, but it's interesting that he says true change comes in men's hearts and ideas. So I supported the experimentation that resulted in the atom bomb. Not to destroy, but to be a powerful idea, maybe, something like that.
Maybe something that could, on the one hand, we haven't had a war like World War II since the atomic bomb. We haven't had a total war because, just like you said, mutually assured destruction. But his statement is still sort of ambiguous there.
Like I said, it's a complicated sentence. It's a complicated.
Yeah, on one level, it sounds like he's trying to justify why he supported the research that led to the atomic bomb. But you could also read it as him saying something like the atomic bomb, something that powerful, might change men's hearts and ideas about war. Like something this awful could finally convince people that war and violence aren't the best way to resolve our difficulties. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe that's it. But that is a complicated sentence. So let's jump back into the story. The atomic bomb was used. After the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945, Thomas used his monthly Japanese language radio broadcast to urge Japan to surrender before more cities were destroyed. For instance, he urged the Japanese people to overcome the resistance of the militarists and adopt the Potsdam Declaration, this declaration the Allied powers had made basically for unconditional surrender. So he's pleading with them in between the time that Hiroshima is bombed and the time that the next bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. He's trying to get them to change course.
Yeah, he warns them that if Japan refused to surrender, other cities could suffer the same fate as Hiroshima. He even identified cities that were potential military targets. He calls them out by name, and he urges civilians to stay away from those cities. He emphasized that the United States and Great Britain did not intend to enslave the Japanese people. And so he argued that only the militarist leadership stood in the way of peace, so they should rise up and get rid of them.
Yeah. So while he supports the research that leads to the atomic bomb, he is horrified by the devastation when Hiroshima and Nagasaki are destroyed. And it sounds like from those radio broadcasts that he's trying to prevent the destruction of a second Japanese city, though he fails. Nagasaki is destroyed on August 9th, 1944.
Which is what triggers the Japanese to surrender, correct?
Yeah. Emperor Hirohito surrenders on the 15th of August, 1945, and ends the war.
Yeah. And then Thomas turns his attention to the veterans. Tell us about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so he's also a ranking member of the Senate's Military Affairs Committee, and he amended the Selective Service Act, the thing that requires you to register. So if there's a draft, you can get called up, so that returning soldiers' jobs would remain open. He also promoted the Women's Army Corps as an integral part of the Army and co-authored the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which today is better known as the GI Bill.
Yeah, he wrote the portion about education, right?
Yeah. So he's serving on the Senate Military Affairs Committee, and he's deeply involved in developing legislation to help veterans successfully return to civilian life after World War II. Probably the most important contribution, like you mentioned, Scott, was that he wrote the education section of the bill, which provides government funding for veterans to attend colleges, universities, vocational schools. And he believed that the returning servicemen were owed a debt of gratitude, and he also viewed it as an opportunity to help them build productive civilian lives.
Yeah, that part of the bill that Thomas authors about education has helped thousands and thousands of soldiers attend college after war. The bill also provides loans, it provides job assistance, hospital benefits, unemployment compensation. So the legacy of what he did with the GI Bill is still alive and well today.
Yeah, the GI Bill is one of the most influential pieces of legislation in American history. And in addition to paying for college or vocational education, it offered veterans a low-interest home and business loans, job placement assistance, hospital benefits, up to a year of unemployment compensation. And these benefits help all those veterans from World War II, guys like my grandpa, transition back into civilian life and transformed American higher education and home ownership in the decades after World War II. So he kind of creates, the world that we're in right now.
Yeah, it's one of those places where history and the consequences of a couple key pieces of legislation becomes a very big practical blessing.
Yeah. And I mean, it still impacts us today, but we're nearing the end of Thomas's career. And there's one last irony that we kind of have to deal with, which is he's this international guy. He's traveled around the world, and he knows history, and he's advocating for, basically world citizens. But that, ironically, is one of the key things that leads to his defeat in the Senate, that leads to him leaving the Senate.
Because why? Isn't it because the post-war climate sort of shifts into the Red Scare, the Communist Scare?
Yeah. So in 1944, Thomas gives a speech called The Four Fears, which is probably a play on Roosevelt's speech, The Four Freedoms, that he gives near the end of the war. But what Thomas is arguing for is global peace against fear-based nationalism. So the text of The Four Fears isn't available online. But if we look kind of at, contemporary and newspaper descriptions of what he was talking about, Thomas believed that these fears were preventing Americans from embracing the kind of international cooperation that comes about after World War II. For instance, the first fear is fear of idealism. He argues that Americans had become suspicious of lofty international goals, believing that they were unrealistic or that they were naive. And he believed that lasting peace required nations to pursue ideals rather than always stay focused on their self-interest.
Yeah, and let me highlight the second fear. The second fear he called the fear of entangling alliances, echoing George Washington's famous warning that many Americans feared joining international organizations or long-term alliances. Thomas argues that in the modern world, isolation was no longer practical and that cooperation among nations was essential for preventing future wars.
Yeah. So things like NATO, he's saying, don't be afraid of something like NATO. That could prevent future wars. Third, this probably didn't win him a lot of points when people are afraid of communists, but the third fear was fear of England and Russia. He believed that a lot of Americans mistrusted Great Britain and Russia, our allies during the war, making them reluctant to work with either power to build a stable post-war world. But Thomas argues that while disagreements existed among the major powers, peace required continued cooperation among the major allied nations.
Okay, so Russia, I understand in terms of fear of communism, but why England?
I mean, there was like tension among the alliance. Obviously, the United States and Great Britain are more aligned than the Soviets because they're communists. But again, he's trying, from what I see here, to get us to stay away from shifting back into the kind of isolationism we were in before World War II, where we were kind of like, we're fine. You guys do whatever you have to do. It's not really our problem. Instead saying, no, we should be cooperating with nations like Britain and Russia to try and establish an international order so another world war never happens again.
Yeah. So that was his third. His fourth fear that he argued against was the fear of revolution. Mm-hmm. So Thomas thought Americans were too quick to interpret every movement for political or social change as a communist revolution. Mm-hmm. He urged people to distinguish between legitimate reform movements and genuine totalitarian threats, which did exist, but not in as much abundance as people thought. He warned that fear itself could become an obstacle to peace. And Casey, I think this is an interesting foil. Just remember this and what we're going to talk about next week with Ezra Taft Benson. So
yeah, interesting.
Park that idea in your mind. Yeah.
Okay, so you take these together, and the four fears kind of reflected Thomas's international worldview. He believed that fear was driving American foreign policy at the very moment when the nation had an opportunity to build a more peaceful international order through institutions like the newly formed United Nations. And again, what he's arguing against is international fear-based nationalism in favor of global peace. That we've got this moment where we fought this terrible war, we can build an international order from it, as long as we don't get so scared about what's going to happen to our countries, which, again, our conversations we're still having today, right? But he does play a key role in creating the United Nations, became a leader in bringing the United States into the United Nations.
Yeah, which kind of sounds cool from our modern perspective, but if you go back into that time and like think about the fear-soaked election cycle and the Red Scare, for him to say that kind of stuff did not play well, actually.
Yeah. So this kind of leads to his downfall, which by 1950, Joseph McCarthy, who's this guy who's virulently anti-communist. This is the Red Scare, that they're accusing people of being communist, and that all of a sudden ruins their lives. During this time, accusations and insinuations about leftist sympathy became really deadly political to anybody serving in the government. In fact, one historian wrote that, quote, the first victim of this deluge of McCarthyism was Utah's senior senator, Democrat Elbert Thomas.
Yeah, and there's going to be another Utah senator named Arthur Watkins, who is going to be one who leads the trials against McCarthy, and that's going to end his political career. He's going to kind of lead the Senate hearings against McCarthy, and that's kind of political suicide when he agrees to do that. I love Arthur Watkins. He's actually part of my wife's family line, and so that's a big deal as well. So anyone who goes against the Red Scare ends up essentially exiting politics during this time. And the attacks are ugly, you know.
Thomas is caught up in this. During the 1950 campaign, there's attack ads accusing him of, quote, presiding at communist meetings and sponsoring leftist organizations. And he's kind of cartooned as a puppet of communists and radical unionists. And the Republican candidate that he's running against really doesn't do a lot to tamp down these extreme accusations. And mostly because of that, Thomas is defeated.
So this man who had fought prejudice, who had fought fear, who had pushed against political hysteria, now gets taken down by, ironically, political hysteria.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough, but that doesn't end his government service. I mean, the following year, he was appointed High Commissioner of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, which is the highest civilian authority over this huge part of the Pacific. He also supervised humanitarian aid and rebuilding efforts in Micronesia, one of the areas that was devastated by the war.
So even after he serves in the Senate, he does keep serving. He just keeps serving.
Yeah, he did. In fact, he keeps serving right up until the day he dies, which is February 11th, 1953, in Honolulu, Hawaii. He serves his country to the very end. And his family received hundreds of letters of condolence from global leaders, including the president and members of Congress. So that's his political career and his life end on the same day. He literally serves till the last day of his life.
And that feels like the right closing note, doesn't it? Like, not just because he was honored, but because the arc of his life really does connect religion and scholarship and diplomacy and labor and veterans' rights and Jewish rescue and Japanese American justice and world peace. Like, this guy, wow.
Yeah, and I mean, this guy's a credit. It's hard to find bad things to say about him. He's one of those rare people who tries to make public life morally serious. He's, in the broadest sense, an advocate for people everywhere in the world.
And I think that's why his story matters now, right? It reminds us of the good that a senator can do, and someone who's willing to stand up for their convictions about the good people, not just of this nation, but of the whole world. What difference that can make, as particularly when you combine education with those religious convictions, and you're put in a place where all of that can have, full expression. Like, he's a great example of what that can ultimately do.
Yeah. That is beautifully put, Scott.
Thank you. I aim to please.
So on that note, we'll end Elbert D. Thomas, who again is forgotten by most people today. He is definitely worth remembering.
Yeah, and he's worth at least a full episode on Church History Matters, which is what we just did, Casey. So, very good. And now just to set up our next episode, where we're going from here, from this virtually unknown guy, Elbert Thomas, to someone who is still very well known and was arguably one of the highest people in the United States government. That's Ezra Benson, and we're going to talk about him.
Yeah, and you hinted at this, but in a lot of ways, we couldn't have two more contrasting figures. So Thomas was a New Deal liberal who championed organized labor, the GI Bill, the United Nations, and international cooperation. Benson became one of the nation's leading conservative voices. So he's strongly opposed to a lot of these New Deal programs, federal programs, and later he becomes a strong voice against socialism and communism. So now what we're seeing is, at the beginning of the 20th century, it's hard to just get a Latter-day Saint in the government. By the mid-20th century, we can have two very influential Latter-day Saints that are at opposite ends of the political spectrum, showing how far we came in a half century, to where you got Elbert D. Thomas, who's a classical liberal, and you've got Ezra Benson, who is a conservative in every sense of the word, and they're both going to church together in the Washington, D.C. chapel. That is an interesting development in not a long period of time. Yeah,
that's right. So that's going to be an interesting thread to pick up next week in our next episode. We're looking forward to that. And maybe before we end, we should give a shout out and credit to one of our friends, Devan Jensen, and Petra Jabari Evans, who actually wrote the article that we used in a lot of the research for this episode today. Yeah. So what else do you want to say about that?
Let's give credit to them, because I don't think either one of us knew very much about Elbert Thomas before we started writing and researching this episode. Yeah. So they did some great research, and Devan just did a paper at the Mormon History Association a couple of weeks ago on Elbert Thomas's efforts to aid Jewish refugees, and we support his research. Hope that he'll continue to do new things. And can I mention one other thing? Devan also wrote the lyrics to one of the new hymns called Long Ago Within a Garden. That's just a bonus fact.
Okay.
It's a beautiful hymn. Go check it out. So full shout out to Devan Jensen, our friend.
Shout out to Devan Jensen, who's not just a good scholar, he's also a good magician. Okay, so
yeah, and a funny guy.
I've seen him do some magic tricks. Anyway, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. Well, thank you. That was a fun run through Elbert Thomas, and we look forward to a deep discussion and what might have some surprising twists in the political life of Ezra Benson. So we'll see you next week.
Okay, thanks, Scott. See you then.